Hi, everybody. Good evening. Welcome to Evoke Therapy Program's broadcast. I'm Dr. Brad Reedy. Today is January 25th, 2022. Tonight's topic, divorce, blended families, single parenting, and step parenting, is one that I get a lot of questions about. In fact, as we were preparing, I was asking for people to put in any questions to the live feed that they might want me to address. And one of the questions that came in was really core to the reason that I think that this is so difficult. I've said historically, when I get asked questions about co-parenting, that it's my least favorite question, and part of that is true, and part of it I mean, kind of in a lighthearted way, meaning that it's a great question to ask about co-parenting, but the difficulty that I have in answering it is the fact of the matter: when you have a co-parent, whether you are married to them, divorced from them, it doesn't matter the relationship you have with them. But when you have a co-parent who you don't feel like is doing their work, is setting healthy boundaries, is interested in their participation in the dynamics in the family that might have something to do with the child's struggle, you are fighting a battle with one hand tied behind your back. And no matter what I say, I can't take away that reality. Now, the good news is that a child doesn't need 20 or even two healthy people. The research shows us healthy people in their lives to be able to access the strength that comes from having an adult in your life that sees you, that is consistent and shows up for you. You need one. The research shows us that just identifying one parent, or one adult for that matter, in your life that is consistent, who sees and understands you, and who shows up in a loving way, that can mitigate a lot of other traumas. It can ground the child. It can regulate the child. It can help the child make meaning of their life in ways that are not as debilitating as when they don't have that presence in their life. So having just one of you is the good news. But again, you're fighting a battle with one hand tied behind your back. You're being undermined, either actively undermined, or maybe passively undermined. And so that's going to be frustration. That's going to take your eye off the goal. So I'm going to talk about that tonight. Talk about co-parenting quite a bit, and talk about some of the other variations of parenting, step parenting, blended family, single parenting, that present a challenge. But what are the principles? What are the ideas? What are the skills and tools that we need to stick firmly to not have it become something larger than it needs to be, a bigger problem than it needs to be? Interesting. I wanted to start off with this quote tonight from Connie Zweig. Connie Zweig is the co-editor of a book, one of the books that really changed my life, made one of the biggest differences in my life to this day, that I read 25 years ago. It's called Meeting the Shadow: Understanding the Power of the Dark Side of Human Nature. And it's a series of essays. She was the editor of it, one of the editors of it. It's a series of essays from therapists, psychologists, philosophers, thinkers, artists, who help us understand that what gets repressed in our unconscious is oftentimes the things that vex us, the things that creep into our relationships in our lives. It's all of that unconscious, repressed stuff that is causing us our problems. And Dr. Zweig was describing at one point about how she had traveled the world. She had looked everywhere. She had sought gurus and teachers and therapy, and advanced degrees, and reading everything that she could to try to find the answer, the solution, the place that would open up for her joy and her happiness. And in fact, she wrote this, what I'm describing to you, this narrative, this part of her story, after she had edited the book that I told you made a difference. It was later on in her career. And what she said in the subsequent book was, she said, "I began to believe that the way I led my life was the source of my pain." And if there was one idea in therapy, no matter what your presenting issue is, a child who's struggling, a co-parent who's not working, an alcoholic, depressed, anxious parent, a sibling that you're struggling with, a friend, coworker, struggling with grief, stage of life challenges, doesn't matter what the presenting issue is. If this idea If the client knows and understands this idea, it opens up all the hope in the world. This is the barrier. When we think that the solution to our pain is in our child, in our co-parent, in our parents, in our sibling, in somebody else. When we imagine that the problem is out there, therefore the solution is out there, we will be forever stuck. When we start to accept the reality that it's how we're living our life that's causing us the distress, we can have hope. And I think it's important to set that as a foundation before I go into anything else tonight, because that's at the core of everything. The core of every session, every client, every issue is this awareness, this acceptance, this surrender, this evolution, this enlightenment, this idea. The most common complaint I have around the topics of tonight's broadcast is this particular topic. In fact, it was one of the questions I was referring to earlier. People tell me my co-parent is my youngest child. You know, I have to compensate for them, make up for them, and parent for them. Like I said earlier, it's a difficult thing to be presented with as a therapist who does parent education, because there's real challenges, real impediments to growth and progress. There are real obstacles that a non-participating co-parent will feed into it. Having acknowledged that to begin with, and I'm not going to say that all throughout the broadcast, the next point I want to say is really the work is to play the long game. It's going to be frustrated if every situation, every circumstance, every decision is for you a high stakes enterprise, a pass or fail, a disaster or a solution. Really, what you're in it for is you're in it for playing the long game, to not get wrapped up in the power struggle with the co-parent, to not become, I'm going to use this word because it's my word for me when I do this. Okay. So I don't mean that you're doing this, but when I become obsessed with somebody else's behavior and how it's causing me distress, I've lost. I've lost the focus on what I can control. There are real injuries that people do to us. And because we love our children as much as we're capable of loving, a co-parent who is either actively or passively participating in the harm of our child or not protecting our child, that's a real injury. That's a real thing. So I'm not dismissing it. But at the end of the day, if I focus on what I can't control, trying to fix, even compensate for, one of the biggest problematic dynamics we see when we're doing family therapy, parent coaching, parent therapy, one of the most common dynamics we see is that one parent who maybe is the more nurturing parent is trying to constantly compensate for the other parent who's the rule parent, right? The more rigid parent, the parent that's more interested in behaviors and boundaries and consequences. And so the nurturing parent, because they see such an absence of nurturing in the rule-based parent, they become less and less attached to the rules, become more and more flexible, more and more permissive. It's like you're sitting on a teeter-totter across from somebody, and if they scoop back on the teeter-totter, you have to scoop back to balance it. So one of the biggest critical errors that we make, that in fact, I don't know that it's possible not to make it to some extent, is that we try to compensate for what we see lacking in the other. It starts to create a divided loyalty and a confusion in the child. They start to be confused about what is real, what is truth, what's healthy versus unhealthy. And in reality, both parents are starting to become out of balance as they compensate for each other. So they have no model of health, right? Ideally, as we grow and mature in our therapy, we find balance inside of here, right? We find the nurturing part of us and we express it. We find the part of us that values being a self and having boundaries and the fact that we have to deal with behaviors. We can't just become theoretical about things. We have to deal with taking out the kitchen garbage at times. We find that balance in here. We work on that. We are, in a healthy, non-shaming, non-guilting way, self-critical. We ask questions. We go to meetings. We listen to podcasts. We attend webinars. We go to therapy to improve and cultivate that balance within ourselves. But when we have somebody playing just one extreme end of the game, we can easily be pulled off our center. I think the greatest loss in trying to compensate for your partner is you don't get to be a whole person. You get to be a sliver, a slice of a person. And the more you pull away on that teeter-totter metaphor that I described, the more your partner, your co-parent has to pull away. And you become farther and farther away from your grounded center self. That's why it can be helpful. And by the way, I'm acknowledging that this doesn't happen in these kinds of questions, these kinds of situations. But if the nurturing, focused parent can be the bad cop a little bit more, it frees the one who's focused on rules and boundaries and behavior to be nurturing, to not be the bad cop. Or if the bad cop decides they're going to be a little bit more nurturing, the one who's overemphasizing nurturing can also start to talk about rules and consequences and boundaries. And so getting pulled out of your orbit, getting pulled out of your center, getting pulled out of your project, getting pulled out of your groundedness is the risk that you incur when you have a co-parent who's not participating in ways that you find helpful. It takes you off focusing on, you can even start. I've done this with my wife. It's something we've had to work through. I have to work through still today. I will make decisions about parenting my children based on how upset my wife is, especially if my children do something that I deem or my wife deems which was directly hurtful to her. I find myself being protective of her and parenting from that place of hurt and anger. I'm not, in that example, I'm not now parenting the child based on what the child needs. I'm taking care of my wife. That can happen to any of us. I always say when I'm talking about co-parenting, if you think whatever your co-parent is doing rises to the level that a legal intervention would change custody or change the decision, consult with a lawyer. In fact, I think if it's even close, consult with a lawyer. Find out, get a reality check about whether or not your concerns rise to the level that a judge might make a decision about who gets to make medical decisions, who gets to make therapeutic decisions. So if it's at that level, if you think there's abuse and neglect that rises up to the level where a judge might intervene, talk to a lawyer and get some feedback. In many cases, you'll find, I'm sure, that the lawyer says, I agree that's not ideal parenting. I agree ideally your ex would, or your co-parent would do something different. But no judge is going to step in. It still doesn't rise to that level. But if you think that it possibly could, absolutely consult with a lawyer. I've learned that, when I was first a therapist working with family, they tell you a few things in graduate school. Don't meet with co-parents separately. I don't follow that rule anymore at all. I think it's stupid. Being on the same page is more important than what decision you make. You kind of have to present a united front. I don't believe in that anymore either. I think you can live and express your truth, and the child will, over time, if you're doing your work, if you're staying focused, if you're working on your recovery, if you're doing your therapy, if you're trying to stay grounded, I think there can be some extraordinarily fearful, terrifying, and upsetting moments in the parenting process. But in the long game, I really have found that the child will gravitate toward the more healthy parent over time. Now, they're not going to, when accountability's on the table, maybe consequences are on the table. They're not going to do that. But if you do your work, if you evolve, if you make a practice of your mental health, improving your mental health, I do believe the child will feel it and sense it. And they'll start to realize who's in this for them and who's in this for the child, or who's in this for the child, who's in this for the parent. The reason I don't have separate, the reason I allow for separate phone calls or sessions with co-parents is if you don't get to say what you need to say to me, you're going to spend all of our conjoint sessions trying to get that point across. So I want to hear your complaints. I want to hear. And my job as a therapist, as a family therapist, is to be able to integrate the information without necessarily assuming that I know the absolute objective truth of things, and just kind of hear where other people are coming from. You know, at our program, the default is we want all the parents that are involved on the weekly phone call, the weekly update, because family therapy happens. Letter writing suggestions happen. Themes are explored and put into action on those phone calls. But if you need something separate, I mean, people get divorced for a reason. The fact that I was taught in graduate school never to have sessions with individual family members in a family system because I would be split, pitted against another person. It doesn't take into consideration that the therapist is supposed to be capable of hearing complaints from several people and being able to synthesize that together. And I know and honor that people get divorced for a reason. And for us to pretend like that's not in play, that doesn't exist, just serves the therapist, the ease for the therapist, doesn't serve the family. Part of it is we have to practice a letting go, not just of with the child, but of the parent. The essence of codependency, and codependency is just a pop psychology or a layperson term for unhealthy relationships. Just think of it that way. It's a catch-all for unhealthy relationships, and it can look very different, very drastically different in different circumstances. But one of the core concepts is learning to let go of control, not just of the child's behavior, but of your co-parent or your parent's behavior, the other parent's behavior. You can't control that. And when you let go, things happen. You're free to act more consciously, more assertively, more clearly, more confidently. I think people hear letting go as a laissez-faire step. I will do less. I'll become more passive. That's not what letting go means. Letting go means letting go of what you can't control. When you hit a tennis ball with a tennis racket in a game, if your focus is on aiming it, you'll lose power and control. If your focus is on practicing the skills, the grip, the stance, everything that your coach has been teaching you, you have all of your power and all of your accuracy. So letting go is about not trying to control other people's feelings, thoughts, reactions, beliefs. So many parents I work with over the years are very successful, frankly, professionally, academically, very successful. And because of that, they have a lot of experience of controlling employees, customers, a lot of people. They're very motivating. They're very, very motivating, charismatic, effective manipulator. And everybody's better off in the business for that when they are those things. But this doesn't work in the parent-child relationship. The child, in essence, is here to tell us that we're not God. We're not in control. And most importantly, and central to the child's need, you're not in control of them. You cannot fix your child. You cannot control your child. You cannot cure your child. You can't make your child feel good about themselves. You can't make them feel the stigma of mental health treatment or remove it. You can't control those things. All you can do is show up, be assertive, be clear, be grounded. Like I talk about all the time. You cannot win. You can only choose how to lose. And all the anxiety and distress and the attempt to try to have things work out the way that you want them to work out, which even if everybody agrees, most people agree, your wants and desires are honorable wants and desires, it's still not within your control. Letting go is understanding the difference between the relationship between self and other, between parent and child, between parent and co-parent. And I think a lot of people, I know I came to therapy for this reason. I think a lot of people come to therapy because they're looking for life hacks. They're looking for the therapist to teach them how to effectively, with ethics and morals, control things that are outside of them so that then they will be happy inside. That's why I started therapy as a client many years ago. And it took me a long time to figure out that that's what I was looking for and that wasn't the real project. The real project was me learning to work on what was inside of me. I remember almost quitting. I've been seeing my therapist for 23 years. And I remember almost quitting at one point. I remember exactly where I was in my car when I thought about quitting. And I thought, it's not going to make a difference if I go to therapy or not. Nothing will change. And I kept going because I was desperate. And I came to understand nothing will change except for me. I will change. And when I change, the whole universe changes because I've changed. And I've changed my relationship to every other person. So letting go is an active, courageous, it's what great artists have to do. It's what great athletes have to do. I'm sure it applies to many more fields, but those are so obvious to us. You can't create a masterpiece if you're afraid. You can't, if you're too afraid. A little fear is okay. Little fear is motivating, but very quickly, as fear rises, performance deteriorates. Our thinking deteriorates. In neurological language, you lose access to the part of your brain that is creative, thoughtful, proactive, rational, that understands time before and after, that understands the impact of choices. And so when you're in your fear brain, your primitive brain, you lose access to your best thinking. Not just artists and athletes, but as a parent or even somebody in business. Like I said earlier, for me, the word is obsessing. When I find myself thinking about somebody else's behavior and how I can fix them and what I need to do and what buttons I need to push. When I'm in a session with a family or with a parent and they're asking me, what do I say? What do I do that will make my son know or make my daughter, my child know that I love them or that they won't feel that I'm attacking them or stigma. I say, the problem is trying to control what they feel or think. That's the problem. The minute you're trying to control what they feel or think, you're lost. You have to throw the ball and trust your throw. You have to swing the racket and trust your practice. I was given the book, The Inner Game of Tennis, in high school. I played little tennis in high school. And my counselor, before I dropped out of high school, gave me the book, The Inner Game of Tennis. And it's about practice, practice, practice. But you can't think about it when you're playing. There's this idea that we have to meet people halfway. And all the wars are fought over this idea. When you're really trying to connect to somebody, when you're really trying to understand them, you go more than halfway. You go all the way. You're not measuring how far they go and how far you go. It's not a zero-sum game, that is, if somebody wins, somebody loses. You do your work. You go to your meeting. You take your lumps, from the letters from your child, the feedback that you get from the therapist, and you work on that stuff. It is so easy to get distracted. Sometimes I tell parents, you try to help parents, but they're so injured and hurt by each other. They have so much trauma in the relationship often that you can't get to this place. But you try to get them to the point where they see that even though the other person has a very different way of doing it, they still have the same goal that the child has a meaningful life full of some joy, happiness, and meaning. And sometimes I say to parents, how about just let them try it for a while? How about giving up your way for a little bit? But because there's pain between the parents, there's woundedness between the parent, and so often the conflict between co-parents is rooted in the wounds from the marriage or from the partnership, that to surrender is to lose, right? To allow them to try it their way is to be the bad one, to be the one on the bottom, to be the one without power, to be the one who's wrong. And so there is healing, there is work in this process that one must sort through in order to understand where their energy is coming from, their parenting decisions, opinions are coming from. Because if it's aimed at the other person being wrong or winning or proving all along that they were the jerk in the marriage in the first place, none of that is conscious, of course. Sometimes it's conscious, but often it's not. If those are the energies at play, you'll never figure out the parenting piece. Obviously don't correct or talk with your children about negative stuff that's said about you. It's critically important that you're getting support. When you're a single parent or a divorced parent, you're at a disadvantage and you need more support. I say all the time, the reason that we want you to go to Al-Anon meetings and Codependence Anonymous meetings and therapy sessions and webinars and podcasts and books is not because we think that you're the cause of all the problems, but because you need extra support and resources to be able to help your child. Our children who end up in situations because of their mental health issues or their addiction issues require us to get more support and help. And when you're a single parent, that's just true when everything's going well. In family systems theory, the theory that underlies family therapy, they talk about it's okay to borrow somebody to pull them into the executive system for single parents. At times, you can even ask for help from the children because resources are limited. It's just to be clear to the children that, yes, I might need extra help from you, the oldest child watching the youngest child, but I'm still the parent. And that can be confusing for the child. But you need extra resources. That's where I was going. You need extra resources. You need a mentor, a sponsor, a group of people, a voice on a podcast, a therapist, a parent coach. And you have to get to a point where, when I talk, that's the thing about skills. Here's the problem with skills. When I suggest a skill and teach it to somebody, they'll say, yeah, but that feels miserable. I feel like a doormat. I feel an immense amount of pain or distress if I don't stand up for myself, if I don't say what I need to say. And I explain, as you do your work, it doesn't hurt anymore what people think about you. It's not perfect, but you become bigger than it. And so when I talk about listening to a child who expresses their upset feelings towards you, I'm not saying tolerate any feeling, or I'm also not saying don't feel hurt by that. I'm saying as you do your work, it just hurts less. As you do your work, you realize that your ex, if they're talking about you, is wounded and it's about them. And the child will feel and sense that from you too. They will co-regulate with you when you are calm, when you are not triggered or reactive to those kinds of things. And in so doing, you become a safe person for your child. You become the adult. You will not hear me say all throughout the broadcast that I'm talking only about co-parents who are just a little bit off. I know there's some co-parents out there who are extraordinarily unhelpful and undermining and sabotaging. I know that. It does not that reality does not is not a reason to abdicate the responsibility of the things that I'm saying. You still have work to do. In fact, you have more work to do. If you're focusing on the co-parent, obsessing about the co-parent, you're a part of the problem. Be a part of the solution. Find ways to take care of yourself. Find ways to get support. Hold boundaries with therapists and parent educators who try to force you to be on the same page or be in the same session with your co-parent if it doesn't feel safe and productive for you, and be a part of the solution. Don't blame your kid's behavior on the other parent for several reasons. Number one, even when a parent is overtly abusive, a child still has a need to love them sometimes. I saw this really painful but accurate quote that I've shared, many have shared, that says, a child that's abused by its parent doesn't stop loving the parent. It stops loving itself. The child has an identity with the other parent, even if the parent is obviously compromised and abusive. And so when you talk about that other parent, you are talking about the child, part of the child. I learned one of my first really powerful emotional lessons I learned was from a professor in graduate school where she worked with children mostly. And she said, when a child comes into a room with a teddy bear, she said, treat that teddy bear like it's a live animal. Treat it like it's part of the child. Because when you're talking to and about the teddy bear, the child experiences it as part of them. You're talking to and about the child. It's the same thing with your co-parent. Doesn't matter how unhealthy they are. And it's not your job to point it out to the child. That does not protect the child. The child just experiences a split, a divided loyalty, a confusion, a hurt. The child experiences it as if you were talking about them. Even if they don't verbalize that dynamic is in there. Let the therapists do the heavy lifting when it comes to confronting your co-parent. And if they're not as active as you'd like them to be, that might be the way to go. Sometimes parents want me to punch the co-parent in the nose, metaphorically speaking. And frankly, if it worked, I would do it. It just doesn't work. I remember, and I think I wrote about this, that I had a couple of parents that I talked with individually, and they both made the case to how the other one was particularly crazy. And they both said to me, as many do, like, I hope you're not buying their BS. And they both had diagnoses for their exes. And they had they had doctors' letters and notes that supported and proved their point. And I remember when I was talking to the second parent, she asked me, "You're not buying my ex's narcissism." Some people get swept up by that because he's a very charismatic, engaging person. You're not buying it, are you? And I said, well, I don't really think of it in those terms. I just try to understand him. And if he has narcissistic traits, I just try to understand the wound, the fear, the hurt, the suffering that is underneath that. And she wanted me to punch him in the nose metaphorically, symbolically. And I said to her, I will do my best to try to help him to show up. And I said the same thing to him when he was talking about his ex. Very common. Sometimes you have to compromise and decide what's good enough. Decide on basic safety and then let go of the small brushstrokes. It's okay to have different rules at your house. If they're grounded in your wisdom, your truth, your wise self, your work, they're fine. The child will figure it out. And if you get scapegoated because you're stricter than the parent, in the short game, you'll lose. In the long game, if it's grounded, meaning if it's coming from a healthy place, not from fear or guilt or shame, you'll win the long game. And like I talk about all the way, you have to give up being right. I talk about this so much because it's my thing. I like to be right, just a little. It's so intoxicating to be right. It feels so wonderful to win. But this work requires something deeper, a willingness to give that up. You have to do enough work to be able to understand what's your need and your child's need. I've heard parents say, I want my son or my daughter, my child, I want them to confront their mother. I want them to confront their father, the co-parent. And often we discover that's your need. Right now, that's too scary for the child. Right now, the child fears, or if they confronted the parent, that they would lose them, or they're not clear about it, or they don't feel safe, or whatever it is. That's the work. The work is knowing who you are. That's the outcome of therapy, is becoming who you are and transforming into who you are. That's the hardest work in the world. And it lasts a lifetime. You have to learn to get clear about your need, what's yours and what's the child, because they're often not the same. Try to focus on shared goals if you can. Try to listen. Decide where you can negotiate. And let go or don't. You can also fight and battle and pit yourself against the parent. Try that and see if it works. Don't talk to your child about the other parent. Even when it seems relatively benign, resist it. And you can let your child know that you're not the best one. When my older children growing up would tell me about their mother, my ex-wife, who we had some co-parenting struggles. We weren't on the same page often, and I fell into every single pit, every single hole that I'm warning you about this evening. There's a part of me that wanted my children to complain about their mother, and I would leak that out. And it just showed my children unconsciously that I wasn't a safe person. And sometimes I would say to them, I can't really respond, or I'm not the best person to talk to you about your mother. Again, if it rises to the level of abuse, then I'll step in. But if it's just about, the way she was treating you and her boundaries, that's not gonna no, it's not gonna rise to the level that I can do anything about it. Um, and don't imagine that you don't leak. You leak. We all leak. One of the biggest undermining processes when a parent thinks that they are objective and that they never leak out their emotions. It's very undermining to the child's reality. If you have energy toward your ex, it will leak out on occasion. It's very tempting to allow your child to replace the parent that is gone if you're a single parent or you're parenting on your own. Looking for them for validation, looking for them to soothe you, making them responsible for your serenity. It's not your child's job to make you happy. It's your job. It's not your spouse's job to make you happy. That's your job. It's not your job to make them happy. That's their job. And knowing all of that, you can be a much better mother, much better father, much better spouse, much better friend. But when we need our children to show up in a way so that we can sleep at night, so I teach this all the time. The adage of you're only as happy as your least happy child is toxic. It's nonsense. It's harmful to children. It's too burdensome for them. When a parent believes and acts as if the child's happiness and well-being is determining the parent's meaning, the parent's serenity, the parent's happiness, the child carries around a great deal of unnecessary shame and fear. Depending upon them for emotional support or validation of the pain you experience from the other parent obviously is not helpful. Only hurts the child. You know, families are not a democracy. You listening to your child doesn't mean they get an equal vote. And when family scientists look at healthy families, they don't look at democracy. They look for a benevolent dictatorship. And maybe that's a little bit tongue in cheek, but it's your responsibility to be the bad guy. The greatest gift, one of the greatest gifts that you give to your children is your willingness to be the jerk in their story, the villain in their story. If you want to know what it sounds like when your child is not taking care of you and when you're taking care of yourself and you're the adult, you're willing to be the villain or the bad guy. But that takes a heck of a lot of work because you don't know, because of what you were taught, the difference between guilt that tells you to do the wrong thing and guilt that tells you to do the right thing. You can't tell the difference between those two. Virtually nobody can without doing a lot of work. So you're when I teach anxious parents to listen more to their children, they get held hostage by it. They think they have to act to meet the child's needs to make the child not anxious, and that's just not true. One of the greatest gifts you can give to a child is your willingness to be the villain in their story. That you use them to meet. I mean, get a hobby. Do make your life a priority. What your child needs. This won't fix them. Nothing I say will fix them. But I can say this: your children, our children, will benefit greatly if we make our lives a priority. Our sense of well-being, our meaning, our happiness. Oh well, if we make that a priority instead of using them to meet all of your needs, being constantly attentive to them. Divorce or marital conflict is not all of the problem, nor is it none of the problem. I remember I was talking to a woman who was considering placement into our program for her child, her daughter. And she told me the story that she had a very acrimonious divorce from her ex-husband. And she was saying, I realized how much pain we inflicted upon my daughter. And really, I've told my therapist over the months and years that I realized that we've created this problem in my daughter. And she said, I was really relieved when my therapist said, it's not, you didn't cause this. And I said, well, it's kind of in between. Yes, you dented your daughter. And yes, your bad behavior and you being emotionally compromised affected your daughter and dented and bruised her metaphorically, of course. And removing that idea to make you feel good doesn't solve anything. Growing up doesn't mean that you realize that you're good, or you convince yourself that you're good or you're not the problem. Growing up, healing, becoming a whole adult means that you realize that you've done things to hurt them and you're still worthy of love and compassion, care and purpose. So adoption, divorce, acrimonious divorces, co-parenting issue. None of it is all of the problem, and it's not none of the problem. It's all some of it. It's in there. And your healing will allow you to take ownership without being saddled and crushed by the shame that so often comes along with us being responsible for things that we've done to hurt people. Again, allowing the therapist to do the teaching, the heavy lifting of the parental education, and not you doing it. Be as overt you can about the differences. It's not about being unified all the time. At your father's house, you go to church on Sunday. At our house, we don't. You can have different rules, and it's frustrating, but I don't think it's reasonable. You got divorced for a reason. Keep the divorce details to yourself. Again, remember, even in cases of severe abuse, the child still identifies with both parents. So if you're saying unkind, cruel, blaming, attacking things about your ex or your co-parent, you're saying it about the child. I described already, these dynamics are present in couples. A lot of times people think this is present in where there's an ex-partner, an ex-spouse. I see all the dynamics I'm talking about today in intact families also. I'm actually surprised by how common it is, how polarized co-parents in an intact married system can be. Try to focus on the goals. Try to allow for some differences in how to reach them. Try to experiment when you can with trying it the other person's way, seeing how it works out without an "I told you so," waiting to come up if it doesn't work. Focus on what you can control. You're modeling for your child. Your divorce, your co-parenting relationship is modeling for your child how to deal with conflict in their lives. And if you're angry and bitter and obsessed with the limitations, the missteps, the lack of work with your co-parent, you're modeling that for them. And that explanation, that scenario, the co-parent has power over you that you've given to them. You can only do what you can do. That's true of everything. You can only do what you can do. And when you focus on that, I remember a specific moment with my daughter, who's now 27, when she shared some things with me that I had done that had hurt her growing up after she had done some significant therapeutic work herself. And I remember thinking, why isn't she picking on her mother or her stepmother or her stepfather? That was my first thought. Why am I the one that's getting all the heat? And after sleeping on it, it took me about 24 hours to get out of a funk, a deep funk. I realized, who cares what she thinks about them? Who cares what she thinks about her mother, her stepmother, or her stepfather? The only thing I have control over is my relationship and how I show up. And while it's tempting to focus on the other people's mistakes, which I thought clearly were worse than mine, it doesn't help me or her or anybody. Step parents have advantages and disadvantages. Ideally, this can't always happen because if the step parent is the stay-at-home parent, it doesn't work very easily. But ideally, some of the big discipline should be voiced by the biological parent or the parent if it's adopted family, the primary parent, not the step parent. Step parents, the biggest problem with step parenting is step parents think they're objective, and they think that that's an advantage. It's actually in some ways a disadvantage. When I teach our therapists at Evoke who are working with parents and families, I say, those of you who haven't had kids have an advantage. You don't even know what it's like to have a kid, so you can't even imagine. End of story. Those of you who do have children, the disadvantage you have is you assume other parent and children relationships and issues are like yours, and they're not necessarily like yours. So the mistake that the step parent will often make is that they think that their objectiveness is some kind of higher vantage point. It's just different. Be gentle as a step parent. Don't be too cocky or arrogant about the fact that you see things clearly. You're just seeing things differently. Yes, you might have some wisdom, but as every parent on here knows who loves a child that struggles and they struggle with them, this is hard stuff. As I say, there is such a thing as a perfect parent. They just haven't had children yet. And being a step parent gives you some distance, allows you to see some things that parents don't see, but that distance is everything, meaning that the parent who doesn't have the distance has to account for that, has to figure that in. So be gentle with your observations, your feedback, your the higher ground that you imagine yourself seeing things from. Sometimes the step parents are great to communicate with the co-parent because there's not all of that history, all of that water under the bridge. It is easy to see what isn't happening. It can offer some clarity at times, but sometimes that lack of connection is the thing that is missing that needs to be accounted for. It's important that the primary parents stay involved, be the bad cop, like I said, and that you have to make do with family circumstances. In our family, that meant all four of us going to co-parenting therapy. And we, in our half of the family, we liked therapy better, so we went more. But we tried to get them involved to make them feel welcome. Didn't do well all the time. Some of my anger leaked out and leaked out often. Going to co-parenting therapy can be helpful even if you go separately. In fact, if I could go back in time, I've never thought this until this exact moment. I think the mistake was that we were doing co-parenting therapy together and we should have done it separately. We could have met with the same therapist, and she's a wonderful therapist. I still refer people to her to this day, but it would have been better off because we were in such different places to go separately. Single parents, one of the challenges, the disadvantages is that you over rely on the child. The child has to take on extra responsibilities and has to often take care of the parent emotionally. You can't, in my family with my wife, we can go in our bedroom and we can complain to each other. We can vent to each other. We can listen to each other. When you're a single parent, you don't have that. And resources are in short supply. Money sometimes, time, energy is in short supply. Frankly, it'd be better if we had 3 or 4 parents around here to spread, with the amount of energy I have some days. The parentified child is the child who has been made to take on responsibilities, duties, emotional obligations that were not theirs to take on, that were not appropriate for them. They have to hide their feelings of anger and hurt toward the parent because the parent is too compromised. They feel an obligation to succeed or not be the one that's struggling because they see their single parent struggling. My little brother saw the absolute torture that I was inflicting upon my mother and made the decision unconsciously. He can identify it today. He's like, I'll just be the quiet one. I don't want to add to it. And that impulse, while we can all understand it, costs him greatly in his emotional development. Your esteem is your responsibility. It's okay for you to be unavailable when you're doing your activities. You have to get relationships outside of the home. Sometimes I tell parents, I wish I could just freeze you for a little bit of time. Not kill you off, not get rid of you, but put you in a freezer so that you're unavailable to the child, so the child can sort it out. Because differentiation, individuating from the child, is just as hard for the parents as it is, often for mothers more, but not always. One of the greatest challenges is in their individuating from the children, because they have been taught by our culture and by their parents, by their background, to over-identify with the child. So sometimes getting you busy is a good thing. giving you an assignment, fostering a hobby, being unavailable. What if I've had people actually literally leave a parenting meeting to respond to a child who's anxious when that would be the perfect opportunity to say, my phone is going to be off for this hour and a half. If there's an emergency, dial 911 or call so and so, but I'm going to be unavailable. I'm going to let you down. I'm going to drop the ball. We have to learn to drop balls. We have to learn to let our children down, and we have to get good at it. Right? It can't be our job to take care of them and every need that they have, because we can't. If blurring of boundaries in single parent households happens, and they will because resources are in short supply, make them overt. Like, I'm going to have you watch your siblings now, but I get to decide X, Y, and Z. Make them temporary and limited in content, meaning you're not the man of the house now. You're not the adult here. I'm the adult. You're the child. We're going to keep it that way. And find other sources of support, which I think I've gone on about. Parental alienation most often happens in divorce. What goes on from a developmental perspective for these kids that are being alienated from their parent is they end up hating part of themselves. They end up identifying with and then hating the parts of themselves that they've been told to hate. You're just like your father. I'm afraid he's like his mother. I'm afraid she's like her father or mother. The child ends up being wounded, not feeling good about themselves, feeling less than. What can we do as parents that have been alienated to manage our grief? Don't talk to the child about it. You have to have other sources of support outside of your immediate family that are adults. Therapists, sponsors, mentors, support groups. Don't fight back. Play the long game. In Al-Anon, there's a saying that says, stay on your side of the street. Don't focus on the other person's problems and how they're not showing up. Just focus on what you need to do. If you need a separate session, like I said, to vent or complain, that can be okay. If you need a therapist to go to vent or complain, that's perfectly appropriate and healthy. But the work is to stay on your side of the street, to not lose focus, to not lose track of the goal, which is supporting the child and where they need to go. Be the safe one for the child. Be the adult for the child. Focus on the long game. Take care of yourself and go to therapy, even if you go by yourself. I get this question all the time. How do I get my co-parent to show up and go to therapy? You ask them, you invite them. One of the techniques I like is you ask them to come to support you. But if they're resistant, just go. Go to meetings by yourself. Go to therapy by yourself. And remember, what others think about you is none of your business. I mean, that comes again from recovery language and literature. What other people think about you is none of your business. What you think about them is none of their business. This goes for our children too, by the way. What your child thinks of their other parent is none of your business. Stay on your side of the street. I hope that's helpful. I'm going to do a Q&A tomorrow night, so I'll take any leftover questions and just wrap up for this evening because we're over time. My books, The Journey of the Heroic Parent and The Audacity to Be You, are on Audible and Amazon. Support groups for current and alumni wilderness families, parents. The next one is January 27th this week. For alumni only, we have one a month. It's just for alumni, February 22nd. February 8th, if you're an intensive alumni, contact Malia at evoketherapy.com or go to our website for more information. If you want to do a deep dive in your own work, Finding You is a great jumping off point, a great springboard into your work. February 23rd through 27th is our next in-person offering. We have an online offering coming up really, really soon. If you want to do one from the comfort of your own home, it's shorter, it's a lot less expensive, and you don't have to travel. And then we'll be announcing and returning to you coming up soon. We have Evoke therapists that are attachment, like Evoke is, attachment-based therapists who are trained in coaching. If you want coaching, contact coaching@evoketherapy.com. Parent, individual, whatever you need. We have pursuit trips for families and adults, anywhere from 3 to 30 days. Think therapy light. Maybe a chance to kind of practice some of the skills while still having fun. We ask all current parents of our program to experiment by trying any combination of 6 12-step support groups. Al-Anon, CODA, Families Anonymous, adultchildren.org is a wonderful option. Also, refugerecovery.org and NAMI.org are other places to go in your local community that have resources and classes that are free of charge. All of these broadcasts are available on your favorite podcast app or Spotify. Just search Finding You and Evoke Therapy Podcast or SoundCloud.com. You can find Evoke Therapy or myself, Brad, on Twitter and Instagram. Excuse me. Using the handles at Evoke Therapy or at Dr. Brad Reedy, DrBradReedy. You can also find Evoke Intensives on Instagram using the handle at Evoke Therapy Intensives. You can find us on Facebook by searching at Evoke Therapy Programs or Evoke Therapy Intensives. And also our blog has wonderful content. Like I said, Q&A, excuse me, my voice is going just in time. Q&A tomorrow night, January 26th, 6:30 p.m. Any leftover questions, anything I didn't cover, you can always send it into webinar at evoketherapy.com. If you can't attend live, you can send them in anytime the thought comes to you, and they'll go and be lined up in our next Q&A. So I'll be dealing with that tomorrow night. You can invite siblings or extended family also to Q&As. They're welcome to come. So I'll talk to you in about 24 hours. I hope this is a helpful point of contact. Have a great evening, and I'll talk to you tomorrow night. Bye-bye.